The Cicatrix Maledictum, or the Great Rift, tore through the galaxy around the time of the fall of Cadia, when Abaddon or Abaddon led his 13th Black Crusade into material space. No, not that 13th Black Crusade, the 13th Black Crusade that came after it. Gilliman himself speculated that the rift formed after Abaddon had learned that strategically destroying worlds rich in blackstone, as well as what are known as blackstone pylons, which appear to be the creation of the Necron and may well be deliberately designed to contain the Great Rift, which I speculate may well be the original ocean which the Eldar culture bathed in at the beginning of the galaxy, but which was then subsequently sealed later as per their mythology, and perhaps due to some collaboration between the Necron and the Eldar after the War in Heaven. I could talk about that a lot more, but probably another day. Please note also entirely my speculation. Abaddon had spent millennia trying to find a path forward that would allow him to reach Terra, as he is obsessed with succeeding where Horus failed. His intention to open a so-called Crimson Path using the destruction of Cadia as its trigger. And it's best to think of Cadia as actually being some kind of great seal or a keystone that he believed would then unleash the rift, which indeed it did. Many have asked, why did Abaddon crash the Blackstone Fortress into Cadia, thereby breaking the planet? Were there no other options? Why would he waste such a powerful, ancient device such as a Blackstone Fortress? Well, in essence, the fortress was already in ruin. It had undergone a boarding action by the Loyalists, and in what was basically desperation at that point, Abaddon decided that things were looking uncertain. He couldn't afford for the efforts of this campaign to then leave Cadia intact, and he needed to score a big win against the Imperium. So he decided to go all in, double down, and threw the Blackstone Fortress like a meteor at the planet. It still scored the traitors a net gain in the big picture. It seems likely, though, that this alone was not the singular trigger for opening the Great Rift. It has been since discussed as being likely a culmination of events which all compounded the instability between the material and immaterial realms. Not least the birth of the Eldar god of the dead, Ennead, which undoubtedly caused massive warp disturbance. Also the return of Primarch Guilliman, whose emergence to lead the Imperium at such a time of disruption undoubtedly bristled the nerves of those who exist in the Immaterium. Having one of the Emperor's sons active once again to steer humanity is no small thing, and not something anyone has seen for a long time. And then of course, yes, the use of Blackstone fortresses and continuing crusades by Abaddon out of the Eye of Terror. Some even speak about Magnus having had a hand in things. One of the core issues that emerged for the Imperium after the violent opening of the Great Rift was administrative organization. Systems were now cut off, and worse, nearly every active Imperial war zone had to devise and enforce its own chronological system. In honesty, even despite the Cicatrix Maledictum, this was a realization long overdue, as the sheer interstellar distances within the Imperium had long made any accurate recording and documentation of time and space a largely wishful thinking affair. This is one of the reasons why we must remain continually open-minded as to just what happens where and with who in the history of the Imperium. For very often, events that we believed to hold a specific order in a chronological timeline may in fact be anything but. And so, despite what many had presumed had been based on chronological descriptions given after the return of Guilliman, me included, it became widely debated that the current date for the Imperium should have now been M42. This was in fact incorrect, and the time period still remains M41 for the Imperium. How was this discovered? Despite the seeming stability of the old date system, it soon was apparent that it had become easy for dates and times to lose all meaning between star systems. Again, it's somewhat surprising this was not addressed sooner, like a lot sooner. But that I guess speaks to how stagnant and inflexible the Imperium was and remains. There are many references in material where the Administratum would receive urgent calls for assistance as an Imperial world is being descended upon by vast amounts of Xenos. The deals that have been made, the favours called in and prices paid to have that request elevated, and to have merely reached that point must have cost a painfully unpleasant price. Too high a price to even consider. And then bleakly, the scribe or administrator member who would finally see this would also then realise that the request was centuries out of date. Into the fire it goes, onward to the next request of that day. This kind of miserable dystopia in the Imperium remains one of my absolute favourite bleak pivots when it comes to the state of the Imperium. For all their golden statues of Astartes, tales told, myths, legends, still countless worlds are being besieged continuously, entirely out of sight and out of mind. Vast reams of critical STC information, probably discarded, destroyed by feral tribes who didn't know any better, menial scribes discounting essential intelligence that had not been stamped with the correct administrative approvals, and consequently, planets of billions are devoured. This is the reality of the Imperium, grinding, creaking, suffering, slowly collapsing upon itself. And then you have this dark stagnation juxtaposed against the immense light of the Emperor's Imperial Astartes. And so it was, of course, Roboute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium, who made the first steps to resolve this one painfully problematic issue. After a long conference with his historiators and the mysterious organization of the Ordo Chronos, he decreed that a single logic could no longer be applied to time and space within the Imperium. Through the then Highlands of Terror, he made his theory and resultant process into law. But even if it had been possible before, in the current age there could be no unified calendar with so much temporal distortion occurring. Even though the rift's warping effects might not have reached the farthest planets out at the galactic rim, its psychic echoes and the obfuscation of the Astronomicon were felt profoundly on outer worlds. Therefore, it made some sense, although simultaneously added additional confusion to Imperial record keeping, to implement Guilliman's new decree that each subsection of the Imperium would maintain its own chronology, all of which would then use the coming of the Great Rift in that sector as its reference point. So this means that chronological record keeping across the entire galaxy is now even more complex than it were before, although it's also probably more realistic and slightly more accurate, but also confusing and difficult, and more akin to how it might actually be to try and manage some kind of galactic empire. The Cicatrix Maledictum became an unsurprisingly defining event for a new era of the Imperium. It remains a very complex situation, and any solutions or conclusions regarding its long-term impact or practical options to seal the tear were far from clear. Suffice to say though, the arrival of the Rift was devastating for the Imperium. It split the galaxy with those segmentum able to see the light of the Astronomicon on one side and those who could not on the other. The majority of segmentum obscurus and ultima are consequently now referred to as the Dark Imperium, Imperium Nihilus. The remaining territory of the Imperium existing in the light of the Astronomicon is referred to in the late period of M41 as Imperium Sanctus. This consists of segmentum solar, pacificus and tempestus, less than half of the Ultima Segmentum and a fraction of Obscurus. Life and travel within the Dark Imperium, Nihilus, remains extremely dangerous. Astropathic communication is difficult or just not possible, and the many enemies of humanity saw this opportunity to now continually besiege isolated worlds. While Imperium Sanctus stands in a far stronger position, it also suffers from a litany of persistent threats, but these are nothing compared to those of Imperium Nihilus. For this reason, it was deemed critical by Roboute Guilliman to forge a stable access point through the disturbance of the Cicatrix Maledictum and enable a continual mass transit of Imperial fleets between the two regions to support further campaigns. But it begs the question, what is in fact the Nachmund Gauntlet? Well, this so-called gauntlet was discovered soon after the Rift tore through the galaxy. It stands as an anomalous warp corridor bridging the rift in space from Vigilus to the planet of Sanguina Terra in the Imperium Sanctus. It exists as one of the few stable channels connecting the two imperial domains. But why it exists at all is not understood. Some of course believe it to be the work of the Emperor's will, that he somehow parted the seas of the storm to allow his faithful to travel and fight the good fight. Toward the galactic northern end of the warp corridor stood the world of Vigilus, an immense bastion world of loyal Imperials, massive hives and industry. Upon entering the corridor, however, you soon come upon the world of Daravar, a stronghold of ancient Imperial knights who, before the dust had even settled after the emergence of the Rift, had turned traitor and aligned themselves with Chaos. There are other industrial and bastion worlds dotted throughout the gauntlet itself, and finally you reach the fortress world of Sanguina Terra. Imperial astrocartographers continue though to struggle to agree on safe or stable routes through the gauntlet, mainly because they're changing all the time. The danger and anomalous nature of the space throughout the corridor is always shifting, making traversing the gauntlet one of the most dangerous crossings in the galaxy. But the very existence of the Nachmund Gauntlet I have found leads immediately to further questions regarding the nature and necessity of such a corridor. If you have galactic warp travel, why is this corridor necessary at all? Well, I'll tell you. I've found quite often that in discussing the events of Vigilus, Arcs of Omen, the Nachmund Gauntlet, there's a common confusion about warp travel in the 40k verse, and to be fair, it's entirely understandable, but consequently confusion arises around the concept of both the Great Rift and such a thing as a corridor gauntlet crossing this region of space. And I'll very often see questions like, why is it a thing at all? Can't you just enter the warp and choose where you wish to go and then you come out the other side? You would just be able to go around this Great Rift because the galaxy is not on a single plane. You don't just put a barrier up and you can't go through it. Or alternatively, another viewpoint is, can't you just travel around the rift? The answer to both of these is essentially no. First of all, you have to understand just how big the rift is, and yes, also, it does exist in the three-dimensional sense. It's so vast that it would be basically impossible to travel around and traverse with traditional power, and then you can't warp around it either. But I think the confusion mainly seems to arise from the fact that many people are obviously well versed in broader fictional space narratives, and so have built up in their minds something that we might call the mainstream of science fiction answer when it comes to travelling faster than light from one point in real space to another. So it's completely understandable, but brings a lot of misunderstanding about how warp travel functions in the 40k verse. And one of the most important things to understand is that the warp is something of a mirror of reality, but not in a very literal sense. The first thing though to understand is that travel doesn't occur at a single point. In many ways it's far more linear just in terms of going from point to point. So in that sense it's more akin to travelling through a wormhole or hyperspace than concepts that are more like folded space, travelling between 2 points in a galaxy without moving. The classic overused illustration of a folded piece of paper and a pencil. So yet again, sorry fans of Event Horizon who want to try and make it a 40k thing, they got it wrong. It's not how warp travel works in 40k. Because in the 40k verse, the shortest distance between 2 points is not 0. In Event Horizon, the ship creates a dimensional gateway that allows the ship to travel between 2 points in the galaxy instantaneously. Similarly also to navigators in Dune who would fold space and the ships will travel without moving. This is not how it works in 40k. Warp travel is still faster than travelling in real space. In fact, it's faster by significant orders of magnitude that without it would make any galactic empire basically impossible. But the key thing is that you must still travel. So in 40k, the shortest distance between 2 points is not 0. It is in fact a straight line. However, you rarely can travel in a straight line, because that straight line is rarely straight because you're in the warp. And in the warp, there's no logic or ordinary boundaries. So in theory, could you just enter the warp at one point and exit on the other side of the galaxy in, say, a day's travel? Theoretically, yes. Is that how it generally seems to function on the whole? No. Usually, when ships travel the warp, the time spent within the warp reduces significantly the time that it would take in real space from many thousands of years to mere days or weeks, sometimes years. Lost ships have disappeared for centuries or longer, and the warp is dangerous for a variety of reasons, some being very obvious, some being very obscure, some that create troubling philosophical questions, such as the fact that some ships may enter the warp and arrive at their destination before they even left their original starting position, meaning they somehow now technically exist at 2 points in the galaxy simultaneously. That's a very problematic thing. But the more standard confusion overall that seems to arise is this concept that both ships will enter and exit the warp wherever you wish in the galaxy. As I said, there are instances where ships may travel far further or become lost, thrown out far from their intended destination, but it's not really true to say that regardless of distance, warp travel functions by just entering at point A and choosing point B, be that anywhere else in the galaxy, and then you just wait to arrive. I think that notion stems from concepts more like hyperspace, where you enter this alternate dimension that allows faster travel, you enter the coordinates you want to get to, and then just wait. Again, not really how it works in 40k. So how does it work, and why do we know this to be true? Well, we know it because it's been very steadily, consistently documented through the lore, unsurprisingly. I recommend some small notes from the Solar War, Navis Primer, as well as Battlefleet Gothic. And as we know, travelling through the warp allows you to travel outside of normal time in real space. Thus, you will arrive at your destination faster. But it's not like hyperspace. It's not just a dimensional space where you can go anywhere. It's more like an immense tempest of an ocean, which is so severe that when you enter, your options at one point are probably very severely limited. You might only have a few choices as to where you can safely navigate, and that route will likely determine your destination. This is not to say that a single entry point predetermines a single exit point of travel. It just might mean that you initially may need to travel elsewhere to then access additional routes. In that sense, you might think of it more akin to a road network in some respects. Now, over time, as with our own oceans in the ancient times, routes have been recorded, charted that were generally safer and more efficient to use, so that steadily in connecting these routes, ships were able to then remain in the warp for longer. But you might still need to exit warp space and travel within a system and then re-enter at another position to access a different warp route. This means that some systems have critical strategic importance in the Imperium for this very reason. Now, hopefully that helps a little to explain the confusion around a ship entering a point and exiting anywhere they wish in the galaxy. But there's a little more to it. It's not technically as simple as that. But it is possible that some ships may be able to enter and navigate a very complex route through the warp to emerge at a whole other segmentum far across the galaxy. But actually navigating through the warp in a 3D sense has been very, very rarely illustrated. But there was in fact one example that illustrates how travelling the Nachmund Gauntlet could appear. And here you can see that it appears as a massive wormholes, conduits, all creating routes from an entry point at either end. So what you then have to understand is that it's obviously easier to enter at one of these entry points than just to translate and merge in halfway along and try to find your bearings. You could do it, but it's probably more unstable, more dangerous. It's going to be more challenging. And then also imagine that all of these routes are shifting slightly all of the time. So if you don't enter at that key entry exit point, if you come in the middle, where ordinarily there is a route, there may not be when you actually translate into there. Worse still, if you choose to translate into the warp anywhere and not at some of the designated charted routes, there could be an immense storm that alters them significantly or closes it altogether. So you can start to understand how difficult and strange travelling in the warp is, besides all of the demonic and ethereal entities that are trying to destroy you. In fact, some navigators have even been said to refuse translation in and out of the warp at non-designated positions because of just how dangerous it is. So that brings us really to the Mandeville points. What's a Mandeville point? Mandeville point is the supposed safe distance where a ship may enter or exit the warp. This tends to be the edge of a star system. Now, these don't appear to be standardized, but they are seen as invisible lines which mark the safe distance required to enter or exit the warp. Were you to arrive inside of that point, the competing forces of reality and paradox may simply tear a vessel apart. Navigators call this rebirth death. Established systems will have navigation buoys or reliably charted points that designate where is safest to translate from the warp back into reality. So again, it's not really true to say that you can just choose when you want to go into the warp and where you come out of it. Although it's not always made clear that that is how it functions, it's more specific than you might imagine. And it really is about charted routes. You go to this coordinate, you enter, and then your navigator can navigate through to various exit points, which are also charted and coordinated. What this means though for ships in the Imperium is that they have to use standard propulsion from a system's edge to a planet and back again. And very often this can mean that even for the fastest ships, it can require a journey of several days to actually reach a world. This is one of those lore technicalities where it may look epic for a huge fleet to pour from the warp almost in the orbit of a planet, but it's not really how it's supposed to work. There's also in fictional reasons why this is a good thing. It means that actual defenses in between planets and surrounding a system on charted routes can be established, which makes sense and is strategically interesting because you have some opportunity to engage with the enemy before they actually arrive at a world. But there are exceptions. Warp gates, or specifically within the primary bastion of humanity, the Sol system, there exist the chthonic gates. Essentially, a warp gate enables stable travel, which is obviously very unusual. But in the case of more standard warp gates, these are mostly between two specific points only. The benefit of warp gates is that they avoid the dangers of warp translation, and so enable ships to enter a system far closer than they may otherwise need to do so if using a standard Mandeville point. The chthonic gates in the Sol system, as far as we know, simply enable ships travelling from elsewhere to translate further into the Sol system. How this was achieved though, or how they function, is entirely unknown, because they originate from the Dark Age of technology, and humanity has long lost the level of knowledge required to begin to understand this. Overall, be they of Xenos origin or otherwise, warp gates hold immense strategic importance for both safety and time saved in space travel. And then you have the Astronomicon. This is essentially a psychic lighthouse built upon Terra, fueled by psychers controlled by the Emperor, which forms a beacon for navigators to use as a point of reference to chart from. Without it, warp travel would effectively become near to impossible, or best case extremely dangerous. Because Terra is located in the galactic west of the galaxy, the Astronomicon only reaches some of the known galaxy. This means in the galactic far east, it is far dimmer or even unable to be seen at all, similarly on the very edge of the galaxy. This makes warp travel in these regions far more dangerous, and is also the reason why it's not correct to say that the Tyranids saw the Astronomicon from beyond our own galaxy. That's simply not possible, but it is the reason why the Tyranids are believed to now be driving towards Terra, as a technicality that is often misrepresented. Of course, with the Great Rift, this immense warp storm blocked the light of the Astronomicon, meaning that all travel within the Dark Imperium Nihilus is extremely dangerous and difficult, thus making the Imperium's efforts to reach this area of the galaxy and establish some kind of support all the more challenging. Some may even suggest it to be impossible now. There is, though, no such thing as a routine warp voyage, for even the shortest jump is a dangerous undertaking. For a navigator guiding a vessel along uncharted routes, the risks increase considerably. Now, during the Heresy, some access points and their nearby planets became key battlegrounds, not to mention things like the Chthonic Gates, which were also embroiled in the conflict, although ultimately didn't prove decisive in the arrival of the traitors. But all of this is why locating a warp corridor such as the Nachmund Gauntlet becomes absolutely vital when powerful warp storms cut off access to an entire region. In the galaxy even now, some permanent warp storms prevent access to other regions. One of the best known examples is that of the Coronus Expanse, which can only be accessed via the Coronus Passage, this warp corridor known as the Maw. And despite the immense danger, many ships which brave the corridor to reach the system on the other side, but traversing the Maw is so hazardous many ships are just lashed to pieces by unknown forces and never seen again. So when it comes to entering the warp, it's not necessarily a wise idea to just enter at any point. Can you technically do so? Yes. But it's not advisable, and sometimes a navigator could even override a captain if they believe such an action to be risking the loss of all. For any chance of surviving warp travel across the galaxy, you need specifically charted routes, competent navigators, the light of the Astronomicon, and favourable tides of the warp. So it's absolutely not as simple as just entering wherever you want to and exiting far, far away. One adjacent other thing to briefly mention, there are other methods of fast and light travel in the 40k verse, such as the Eldari or the Old One's Webway. This exists outside of the warp and is considerably safer, but it's too much to mention in detail here. But basically, there are other means of travelling faster than light across the galaxy which don't require going through literal hell. But overall, that's really the basics of warp travel. It's ultimately, in many ways, still not completely clear just how all this works, which is no surprise because there's plenty in the 40k verse which fits that description. And when it's something as vague and mysterious as warp travel, it's no surprise there either. But there is a reason why it's called the Sea of Souls, for the void space of the warp is a savage ocean, and seemingly where you can enter has a significant bearing as to your chances of survival and success, and then you still have to navigate through hell. Safe and efficient point of entry, charting a course, avoiding dangerous currents and storms that would trap and quickly destroy your vessel, all fall upon the navigators assigned to a vessel to determine, an individual whose entire being is spent knowing, feeling and learning about the warp, and establishing safe routes through and around devastating warp storms, and I've discussed navigators previously, see the link below. But again, hopefully this makes it somewhat clearer. You don't travel instantly from one point to any other in the 40k verse. You don't enter the warp and just travel to your destination. It's a very involved, challenging process of navigating routes and courses to reach an ultimate destination. And in some instances, even using the warp could take still many months, even years. And if a warp storm is disrupting your route, you might not actually be able to reach a system at all. And this is in fact how some systems have ended up being cut off from the Imperium for centuries, because there's no actual way to travel to them, and to do so in real space could take many millennia. In some respects, this could actually be positive for a planet. If they just existed outside of the Imperium and too difficult to reach even for other Xenos, you could actually end up in a quite idyllic situation. So while the warp enables humanity to travel the galaxy, it's not a means that's reliable by which you can just quickly or easily travel anywhere you wish. And this extreme difficulty and danger is why the devastating arrival of the Cicatrix Maledictum meant that many well-charted routes were just completely obliterated. And as a result, it became clear to any half-decent Imperial captains and senior officials that from its inception, any established points of travel across the rift bridging between those two regions in real space or the warp would become quickly raging war zones of unfathomable strategic importance, which is where we find ourselves at the Nachmund Gauntlet and Vigilus. In the period that led up to the Nachmund War, Vigilus was already acutely aware of the role it may have to play for the Imperium. Its proximity to the Eye of Terror had long put it on a war footing, which thankfully meant the planet was well equipped and fortified, but now the stakes had increased significantly. Vigilus had changed from being a strategically important support world to one of the most critical planets for the Imperium in the entire galaxy. The planets of the Vigilus system, a short distance from and to the galactic east of Cadia, found themselves on the wrong side of this abhorrent rift, but through a twist of the Tzeentchian strands of fate still remained accessible to the Imperium Sanctus. But for those stranded on the dark side of the galaxy, it was immediately apparent they had now entered a new darker phase of existence for humanity. Saying this though, worth remembering that the dark side of the galaxy, that is, Imperium Nihilus, was not literally dark. It didn't destroy the stars of systems, it simply inhibited warp travel by obscuring the Astronomicon. So on both sides of the Imperium, the Great Rift appeared often as a mere purple blur in the skies above their worlds during the day. By night though, it became far more insidious, more alive and dangerous, and some reported seeing faces and strange nightmarish visions drifting across it. When the rift split the Imperium in half, suddenly many thousands of worlds were faced with the mind-altering maw that was ever-present and unavoidable at all hours of the day. It robbed citizens of sleep, distorted their minds, it even went as far as to interfere with devices such as chronoslates and data webs. Due to its proximity to the rift, curfews were put in place for all citizens upon Vigilus as twilight fell and the strength of the Cicatrix Maledictum increased. This was no speculation or fear-mongering by authorities. The proximity of Vigilus to the rift meant that by night, a mere moment of attention risked individuals becoming contaminated by its malevolence and therefore rendered susceptible to psychic phenomena. This kind of infection by the warp is why often when humans have any kind of contact with the horrors of the Immaterium, they may well be purged, that is to say executed, by default. For those who understand the warp and the beings who exist within, they know all too well that it's very likely too dangerous for ordinary humans to live after witnessing the pure infinity of the void. Exceptions are made, of course, for those with specialized training, proven service records that demonstrate evident ability, and the mental strength to stand against the darkness. Micro-adjacent side note. I often hear people asking, do ordinary citizens know of chaos and the warp? How could they not, given the events that have occurred over the past 10,000 years of Imperial history? But the answer is more nuanced, because although worlds who directly face the enemies of chaos and some who serve within the Imperial Guard are more likely to have some baseline understanding or belief about the warp and chaos, there are significantly more worlds who really still know nothing of it at all, which is likely to their benefit in some regards, but that actually brings you back around to the Emperor's conundrum: what's better, ignorance or the primordial truth? So the answer really is it's variable, and it's worth remembering that some planets of the Imperium do not even believe that Xenos exist in the galaxy, so sheltered are they, and they only hear of such things as rumours, fishermen's tales that trickle down through the populace of a hive city from passing traders, passed from one person to another, around stories in bars and whatnot. So very often these kind of stories are just dismissed out of hand because such things sound surely completely nonsensical. So the Great Rift has already proven to have a disruptive and pervasive impact on human populations. Within the claustrophobic hab levels of hive worlds, strange graffiti and artworks are found scrawled upon walls. Their forms mirror the shapes and faces seen in the rift. Those who, especially in the beginning, ignorantly stared up at the rift for too long, found it as if a bright light had shone into their eyes, and now they could see its image permanently as if it were burned in motes of light to their vision, seemingly scarring their retinas permanently so that even closing their eyes tightly shut could not allow them to escape its form. Parents also began to discover to their horror that rift-shaped birthmarks were appearing on infants of hive cities close to the rift, something they of course made great efforts to conceal from authorities. Within the darkened corridors of hive cities, it even spread its form through natural organic growths, water stains on the walls, and the ceilings of water purification plants which mirrored the dark scar above. Purge squads of the ecclesiarchy made it their mission to exterminate all visible signs of such phenomena, but these heretical contaminations became even more prevalent and severe as time wore on, to a point that on Vigilus, when earthquakes were occurring and land opened up, upon investigation the landforms mirrored the swirling scarred forms of the Great Rift. With such detail it even represented thin land bridges which directly corresponded to the position of things such as the Nachman Gauntlet. Now these troubling occurrences could be easily dismissed as being superficial simply due to the proximity of the planet to the rift itself. It is worth to recall that for many worlds, tolerance of even the smallest presence of chaos contamination can be devastating. Although the Imperium tells bold and impressive tales of repelling traitor assaults, it's more common that when a world begins to fall to chaos, it is rarely subjected to huge planetary assaults. More often, when a planet is corrupted by chaos, it will occur via cults who have made it their primary goal to remain out of sight, but not entirely out of mind. Discovery of these cult cells can be very difficult, and it's only when initial signs that something is more broadly wrong could an investigation then be launched. And this could be very vague things like an increased general sleeplessness or shortened tempers in a population, persistent headaches, continual errors in fabrication and industrial centers, even just simple tasks. Such symptoms, though widespread, may continue to appear harmless and without a direct cause, but over time these may suddenly become more acute and then start to cause violent outbreaks, persistent sleeplessness causing citizens to even lose their minds, and very quickly a world can then begin to unravel and enter an unexpected downward spiral that is difficult to claw back and return from. Because as symptoms begin to worsen and increase exponentially in a populace, this is finally when fanatical cult forces may choose to break out into the open in an attempt to then seize power upon a world now significantly weakened. This is of course comparable to the strategies of the Tyranid cults, the Genestealer cult. Both operate by weakening a world internally before attempting to break the final pillars that are sagging now under the immense weight of societal collapse and are by now barely able to support a planet or hive city's stable operations. This is of course why the Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, Ministorum, the Sororitas continue to exist, because they will daily scour hive worlds seeking to purge any who show even the smallest signs of unusual behaviour, not to mention just general zealotry, purging squads who are little more than rabid religious worshippers in an orgy of violence, execution and immolating those who descend into the dark corners of a hive to escape the light of the Imperials. These individuals could be outright killed on the slightest pretext. Still, for as disorganized as these expeditions could be, they can actually be quite productive for the inquisitorial agents or ecclesiarchy operatives who are monitoring such activities. One of the most notable signs being, do they return or not? That can be quite indicative of a larger problem. For the world of Vigilus, its importance and stability had become vital, and it obviously did not take long for Roboute Guillermin himself to designate Vigilus as being invaluable. The fight for the Nakhman Gauntlet and Vigilus as a beachhead or staging position for Imperials attempting to maintain stability within the Dark Imperium began almost immediately. Thankfully, as noted before, it was already a strong Imperial world boasting both impressive industrial and defensive capabilities. It had a heavy presence of Imperial Guard upon the world, the Vigilant Guard and Tempestus, and this had now only been bolstered by the exodus of survivors from Cadia itself. And in what is a good example of how the Imperium does not really have a standardized template for leadership over planets, Vigilus was maintained by a loose confederation of both elected leaders and nobles called the Aquilarian Council, or to the Mechanicus, the Council of Cogs, which is surely a far more pleasing title. Comically, though, the fact that delegates had found it extremely difficult to even agree on a name for themselves illustrates how ineffective and disruptive a leadership they were. Only their impending annihilation at the hands of many enemies of humanity focused their minds on the task at hand and allowed them to put petty differences aside for the time being. This was good timing because when a teeming wah of orcs burst from the Great Rift, the system's defenders responded with impressive response times and levels of force. Vigilus seems secure, at least on paper. As a planet, Vigilus was as inhospitable as many an Imperial hive world. Its desert wastelands that stretched out as wide as oceans between each city hive sprawl were not merely bleak and barren, but also actively dangerous. In places, the chemical composition of the dust dunes was so saline that it would burn exposed skin and could in fact desiccate bare flesh in a matter of hours. Not a problem with the right protective clothing, it would be true, but as you can imagine, dust storms could cause this material to be whipped into every chink of a traveller's gear and carried inside. Not to mention, of course, the shell-armoured predators that prowled the dunes and preyed upon the unwary. So it was a very dangerous environment. Hive sprawls are the main city formation upon Vigilus, and actually much like Atoma Prime's hive city of Tertium, these are a format of hive city that expand outwardly as much as vertically. So consequently they can span much larger areas than you typically see in a hive city, as large as a continent, and contain many tens of billions of Imperial citizens. Vigilus had long been a way station for Vigilus had also been something of a way station for forces that included Space Wolves and the Skitarii legions. Its industrial exports were also vital for the general Imperial war machine, so much so that within Segmentum Obscurus it had been designated as a planet focused entirely on production of war material and manpower, its specialty being defensive technology, which obviously with the current situation was no bad thing. Had it been a paradise world, things may have gone south far more swiftly. Even more auspiciously, the Mechanicus upon Vigilus had been blessed with the STC for Psi-Tech force fields. Holy Mars had even authorized their production. So the force fields that had been installed around the perimeter of every continent upon Vigilus, and these generally were enough to easily protect the world from wandering Xenos. The only price asked by the Mechanicus of Vigilus to compensate them was to be left alone upon the forged continent of Mega Borealis. Not really a continent, more a sprawling industrial cityscape, not dissimilar to the others that already covered Vigilus. But this in time proved to be a poor exchange, because the Mechanicus mining operations badly damaged the planet's subterranean water reserves to the point that available water started to become extremely scarce, and the Mechanicus paid little care to such matters, however, and continued digging deeper. So because of the severely diminished water availability even prior to the problems caused by the Mechanicus, agriculture upon Vigilus was extremely minimal. In fact, the planet's food production came from obscure sources such as vermin abattoirs and subterranean nutrivats, and these unpleasantly recycled fat-rich runoffs and nutrient-rich sweats were collected as they dripped from the grates of the planet's overpopulated manufactorum habs. There are of course other sources which we'll get into later. But water and its source became a powerful status symbol upon Vigilus, directly indicative of wealth and position. To nobody's surprise, the working population would drink water that was often dirty, foul-tasting, yellowish, but affordable and not completely toxic. The upper classes of citizen drank crystal-clear aqua glacius, mined from the polar continent of Calyx Bane. The faithful of the Ministorum in Hyperia Hivespool drank recycled water purified with holy oils, aqua sanctus. The Adeptus Mechanicus drank the aqua meteoris that they mined from frozen asteroids. So it was a complex situation in many ways for a pretty basic but essential planetary resource. Over the decades and indeed centuries, Vigilus had become a steadily more complex political situation, to the point that it now hosted several distinct power bases, all determined to pursue their own agendas no matter the cost. There was the Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, which included the Sororitas and their own guard force, the more standard forces of the Imperial Guard as well, and then many of their number were also aligned with the Ministorum forces that had proven successful in steadily permeating through into regiments. But overall this caused tension among the factions, there was significant squabbling over important issues and resources, and then of course there was the standard aristocracy and nobles which threw all their requests into the mix. All of this though did dissipate when the disaster of the Rift bore down upon the world and its greater significance became apparent, or at least for a short period of time. When the skies split around Vigilus, many feared the planet would be consumed forever. But instead, it held the Cicatrix Maledictum at bay. Was it faith, the Emperor's will, a fluke of quantum entanglement or some other phenomena that kept this rift passage open? None could point to any concrete conclusions. But it was immediately targeted by covetous eyes, who set in motion their diabolical plans to secure it for themselves. Drakari raids struck from the webway. Eldari sent emissaries to warn of a greater enemy yet to come. And upon Vigilus, strict new laws were imposed making it forbidden to look at the night sky. Curfew imposed to ensure all citizens remain indoors by night or face a flogging. As is so often the case, the heavy-handed but albeit necessary imposition of these new rules caused many within the population to seek out cults and groups who opposed such restrictions or were curious about the arrival of this strange new celestial phenomenon. The warp rift of the Cicatrix Maledictum scarred the sky above Vigilus, and as I noted earlier, the first enemy that the citizens of Vigilus found themselves battling were not to be outside forces of the Xenos or Heretic. Like many planets consumed by the malevolent ethereal forces that transition across the immaterial to the material plane, the people of Vigilus found themselves suffering continually upsetting and inescapable nightmares. They suffered sleep deprivation, shortened tempers that saw workers escalate everyday disagreements into physical confrontations evermore, every day. And these disagreements could eventually be qualified as turning into broader skirmishes, brutal random beatings in alleyways, embittered, disillusioned industrial workers refusing then to work and vocally protesting against the increasingly strict lockdowns that were being imposed upon them. Such disobedience even began to present itself in the form of more planned, structured uprisings, even astonishingly provocative acts of assassination in the upper spires. Vigilus as a planet had become so precarious overnight that it looked set to fall without a single traitor even having set foot upon the world. Vigilus was a massive world, and over the millennia upon it had been established multiple artificial continent-scale cities known as hive sprawls. Now these sprawls will contain upward growth much like a hive city, but they also expand outward horizontally. They're generally much larger than a typical, more vertically styled hive city and could contain many times more the average population. So instead of 1 to 10 billion, a sprawl could see anything like 10 to 30 billion citizens. Although obviously this can vary greatly depending on who controls such a city, its layout, design and overall purpose. The worlds which contain these continent-sized hive sprawls are the first steps to seeing a world become an ecumenopolis such as you see on Terra itself. These are worlds where the cities have grown so vast and linked together that they now effectively cover the entire surface of a planet. And this actually had begun to be discussed as an option for Vigilus. They were looking to their future, they were thinking about potential cities linking at some point. But on Vigilus, two of the biggest and most notable hive sprawls were known as Hyperia and Mega Borealis. Hyperia being the capital with its ministorum and governor's palaces, the Ecclesiarchy upon Vigilus had become a dominating power and had in effect its own city-state within Hyperia, including its own military force with the inclusion of Sororitas, the Vigilant Guard, and the Tempestus. Mega Borealis was the continent ceded to the Mechanicus in the ancient history of Vigilus, who then proceeded to basically strip mine the territory they controlled, including boring immense cavities out of the crust of the planet itself to create so-called bore hives. These are effectively hive city icebergs. They still are impressive from above, but 10 times as much below the surface, and it was in the deepest depths of the Mega Borealis where they discovered and began to mine the veins of blackstone, that material which the Imperium has quite quickly discovered to be extremely critical for potentially future control of the galaxy. Unfortunately, others, including the Necron and now Chaos, are also well aware of this material, the Necron of course being aware of it for millennia, millions of years. In the darkest zones that were off limits to all but the most trusted members of the Mechanicus, servitors whose minds are continually wiped operate in near pitch conditions, harvesting this precious blackstone. The mineral is then stockpiled at the same level and heavily guarded. Its value is beyond estimation in the realm of generally traded materials of the Imperium. And we interestingly also do have information on the drills used by the Mechanicus to create these vast borehole mining operations that would later be backfilled as hive cities. The drill engines were several miles in diameter and so huge they had to be transported to Vigilus. The seismic activity of them on the surface was so significant that volcanic eruptions and earthquakes became commonplace. And once the spires were built up from the bore hives, they were so tall that some of the uppermost levels even pierced the atmosphere, meshing with space docks where ore barges and manufactorum ships were moored. The Mechanicus are long known also for their clever usage of a planet's own energy to power their cities. There have been many examples of them using the very liquid rock, the geothermal elements, even building their structures in or around these extremely hazardous conditions using force fields to withstand the immense heat and pressures. They equally use such raw power to then fuel their factorum and research facilities. And such was the case with the Storval on Vigilus. Deliberately, this was an area constructed over fault lines of the planet's crust, its volcanic generators harnessing the energy created by the continent's continual eruptions. And the technology to do so is believed to have been based on an STC pattern. This created a pleasing feedback and limitation of net energy loss during their drilling operations within the Mega Borealis, because each seismic event that they triggered actually fueled their power harvesting operations at Storval. At this location, once its immense capacitors and generatorum were satisfied, any excess power produced was then routed to Mega Borealis first, and if its needs had already been met, this could then be shunted on to other hive cities in order of priority, i.e. who could bid the highest for extra power, which the other hive cities almost always needed, and unsurprisingly it was generally sucked up by the aristocracy, sometimes industrial concerns. And another masterwork of the Mechanicus on Vigilus was the so-called Omnissian hoist. Essentially, this was the means by which they were transporting materials from the surface up into orbit through Mega Borealis via these immense spires. Apparently this was made possible by a complex system of microfiber carbon chains and duroplast capillaries. Partially telescopic and modular, these were created on an industrial scale by the workshops of the Mega Borealis primary hive, hauled into the stratosphere by a succession of low-orbit tugs. Mortwald was the city where consumables, primarily foodstuffs, were produced. They were able to grow what were designated as hyperflora, an extremely hardy form of cacti and other succulents, and these were clearly not ordinary cacti as we understand them to be though. They were said to be large enough to create entire forests and which contributed an oxygenating effect to the planet, for a period of time at least, but this was eventually overridden by the massive amounts of pollution. So suffice to say, whatever variation of bizarre cacti exist here on Vigilus, it's nothing that we would recognise or be familiar with, both in their ability to provide food production and oxygenation, nor to grow to such a scale that they could be described as forests. Because of its noble aristocracy and leadership, the most wealthy and powerful here lived in massive biodomes, which were essentially self-contained paradise worlds, completely alien to the heavy pollution, toxic wastes which existed outside. They had beautiful lakes, waterfalls, sculptures which punctuated lush, verdant gardens and viridian forests. Everything that one would associate with outstanding natural beauty was here, in stark contrast to the outside of the domes. So when war came to Vigilus, to no surprise, the domes suddenly became heavily reinforced with massive firepower surrounding them, including outside of Mortwald, which had built up its bastions and trench lines. The almost entire eastern border of the hive sprawl became a defensive line. Most interestingly and bizarre is a specific detail about Mortwald, that within the southern region of the hive sprawl were their so-called vitae docks. Here the rich and powerful could engage with extremely unusual, powerful rejuvenation techniques, some merely stripping years off an individual, not just cosmetically but quite literally rejuvenating them. But we know that in the past, for example, the Imperium had discovered that some alien species could be crushed and rendered down into a potion that extended mortal life. But this had been something that was outlawed, and it was already exploited so viciously that that race was now believed to be extinct. But here on Mortwald, they had processes to achieve much the same result, some of which were really quite extreme, and bordered something more likely to be seen put into practice by Drukhari. For it is said that within the biosantic flesh plants, they were capable of detaching the heads of the rich and wealthy to then transfer them and suture them upon collected younger bodies. Such outlandish and extremely complex procedures were apparently not beyond the biomagi of Mortwald, although just where they acquired these new bodies for the privilege to be transferred onto is perhaps best left to the imagination. But it should be noted that individuals simply going missing within a hive city is a daily occurrence. This is though a great singular example of how ordinary humans look to extend their lifespan in a galaxy which is very often measured in many centuries if not millennia, far outside an ordinary human lifespan, especially in the conditions of M41. Now we said earlier that the source of water for untold billions upon Vigilus was of critical importance, and this is where Otek hive sprawl comes into play, for it contained 5 vast reservoirs, which to no surprise became a desirable asset for all concerned during the first phase of the Vigilus war struggle. The reservoirs were in fact so vast that they more resembled landlocked seas. They gathered water from deep under the planet's crust via an elaborate system of pumps, capillary banks and pipeways, and were contributed to from specifically designed precipitation sites. For most of the water needed by the hive cities was pumped through pipelines, which also contained pipes to return polluted water, industrial runoff and reclaimed biomass, which was able to then be recycled and processed into potable fluids. And this is a good example of an Imperial world which is actually moderately self-sustaining, which can be somewhat uncommon with many Imperial hive worlds, requiring off-world supply for key resources, even for the absolute basics like water and food. Many hive cities in their planets are so barren and contaminated that self-production is now near to impossible, but most hive worlds will at least have entire districts dedicated to recycling and reducing the wastage of such critical necessities. They also will generally produce something of value which can be traded off within the general structure of the Imperium and the Administratum. Of course, any water sent between hive cities was mainly for the lower populace, because water, and specifically